Supreme Court denies request for Bank of Canada lawsuit to proceed. Toronto, May 31st, 2017. After nearly 5.5 years of contentious litigation between the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform, COMER, and the Government of Canada, involving 3 separate federal court and 2 additional federal Court of Appeal hearings, resulting in contrary decisions, on May 4th, 2017, the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed COMER's leave, permission to appeal, dismissed COMER's leave application from the second judgment of the Federal Court of Appeal. Following established practice, the Federal Supreme Court does not issue reasons when it dismisses a leave application. The dismissal by the Supreme Court of the leave application means only that the court does not want to hear the appeal. The jurisprudence on this is clear. It does not mean that the lower court decisions are correct in law. The possible reasons for the Supreme Court not wanting to hear the case are many and various, including the washing of their hands, deference to the political process. Hence, this is why reasons are not issued by the Supreme Court in leave dismissals. We believe, of course, that the case has ample merit and should have proceeded to trial. It is not uncommon for the Supreme Court to refuse leave on a given issue multiple times, finally to grant leave, and the case then succeeds. The Supreme Court controls its own agenda, both in its timing and on the merits of issues it will or will not hear. Annually, fewer than 8 to 10% of all cases filed are granted permission and heard at the Supreme Court of Canada. It should be noted that throughout this arduous and expensive legal process, the substance of this lawsuit, initiated in the public interest, has not been addressed. The matters raised by the lawsuit are summarized in an attached original news release issued December 19th, 2011. They can be made available to you if you haven't.
If anybody needs a copy of this and the other one, I brought them.
Oh, good. Terrific. Okay. While COMER is disappointed in the Supreme Court's failure to comply with its perceived duty to the plaintiffs and to the citizens of Canada under the Constitution and the Bank of Canada Act, 2 things are undeniable. 1, through this long judicial odyssey, public knowledge, awareness, and consciousness of the vital issues have been raised immeasurably, not only in Canada, but abroad. We know this from the significant feedback and informed commentary COMER and its legal counsel have received. The current Supreme Court dismissal is not the end of the struggle over these issues. The proposed Canada Infrastructure Bank makes crystal clear the urgent need to now concentrate efforts within the political arena. In its arguments, the Crown has contended that the government's decision to drastically reduce its borrowing from the Bank of Canada was made by the people of Canada through the political process, although the changes made were never debated publicly, nor in Parliament. This failure of the political process has led to the exponential growth of Canada's debt incurred by all 3 levels of government due to accumulated deficits and compounded interest charges, as well as to significant fiscal restraints on funding government programs and infrastructure expenditures. There you have it. Okay.
Well, I have nothing to add, just to say that Ann Emmett, Margaret Rao, and Judy Lewis are sitting here at the table, and they're executive members of COMER, and I've been asked And I've been asked to be present in case there's any questions that refer to the legal challenge that was brought and carried through the courts for the last almost 6 years on this issue. So my name's Rocco Galati, and I was counsel to COMER throughout this litigation.
Rocco, I'd like to hear from both you and Ann Emmett on what you believe the political implications of the Supreme Court not hearing this case are going to be. In other words, what kind of effect do you expect this decision to have on our continuing democratic process?
I am shocked to hear that you think we have a democratic process, but I'll take it in that context, okay? When this case was going through the courts, I was interested to see a video where Prime Minister Trudeau, who was then on the campaign trail, was asked by someone, "What do you think of the Bank of Canada case?" And he turned to the camera and said, "I don't believe in conspiracy theories." That was his comment. I don't think he knew the first thing about this issue. Since this case has gone through the courts, his office and his party has been made fully aware. And so I think this infrastructure bank is in part a tepid placebo to try to appease that awareness and that complaint that people are more aware. The political fallout, I'm not a politician, I don't know. I think since the Chrétien government, as I've stated in the past, we've been living in a quiet dictatorship since the Chrétien parliament. I don't think the politicians care a rat's ass about what people have to say about these issues, except to the extent it affects their ability to get re-elected. We don't have responsible government anymore. They're in the mode of damage control. They don't really care what the people think or want. So what the political fallout will be, I don't know. That depends on the reaction of people. And I know this issue, I've had literally hundreds, if not over 1,000 calls and emails from Europe, from around the world, from economists, from politicians on this issue. This issue is on the radar in Europe as well as everywhere else, from Iceland to and in the States and in England. You know, this issue is not going away. You know,
There's a referendum in Switzerland coming up.
I have a quick question from a gentleman that's on Facebook. He's asking, what in your opinion would the Supreme Court need in order for the case to be heard?
Yeah, look, Supreme Court is a very complex institution. People should not misunderstand. They have limited time. They have a limited docket. They don't reveal what's on their juridical, or I put political in small p, political agenda. And the case law from the Supreme Court itself is very clear. A dismissal of leave is not a comment on the merits of anything whatsoever, because I've had instances where I've had cases go where we didn't get leave multiple times, and then finally when the issue got leave, whether it was through my firm or another firm, it succeeded. So you can't read anything into a leave application. All it is we don't want to hear it now. That's all you can read.
Anne was supposed to respond as well, so
Yeah.
Anne, go ahead.
I can't.
No, just hold it. You can hold
You
it.
just hold
Just
your
hold
Oh,
it.
I can?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Just hold it.
I'd like to make 2 points in response to your question. First of all, did you see, hear, or have you read the debate that the NDP instigated in the House a couple of weeks ago or so?
I mean,
Let's assume the person watching this film says no.
Oh, yes, okay. Well, the NDP forced a debate in the House a couple of weeks ago. I've just been reading it. If you think for a moment that we really, under the present system, can maintain a democracy, you should read this debate, the transcript of this debate to start with. The arrogance, the audacity, and the contempt for Parliament that's reflected in the government's response to the criticism of the proposed bank is absolutely stunning. absolutely stunning. And this is very unusual. I think that the proposed Canada Infrastructure Bank is that, first of all, of course, it's an effort to end run the Bank of Canada. It replaces what is a public bank with a privatized bank. And when you read about what has gone, before the legislation creating this bank has even been passed, is that all right? Before this legislation has even been passed, the government has put out notice for people to apply for positions on it. The degree to which the government has totally abdicated control over this bank is astonishing. And so I think that, this is an unusual development, because I've never heard so much discussion about it when they've buried something like this in an omnibus bill. They buried it in 300 pages of a budget bill. And I think that it's tremendously important that we confront on this issue, that we help people to understand what's going on. So the Canada Infrastructure Bank, in my view, is a critical threat to an already half-dead democracy, but it's also an opportunity. And
I remember back in the early 60s, 61, the issue of the Bank of Canada came up with Diefenbaker and James Coyne. And people, especially I think in the press, have forgotten that the debate about the autonomy of the Bank of Canada versus it being accountable to Parliament has been an ongoing debate in Canada. Graham Towers, the first governor of the Bank of Canada, said absolutely we can comply and do what the government asks for through Parliament. The next governor, James Coyne, said no, we're not going to do that. So the issue of Bank of Canada autonomy, in my view, is one of the central problems, and one of the plaintiffs, Bill Krim, if he was here today, would likely talk about that. And his first book was called A Power Unto Itself, the Bank of Canada. So people might want to take a look at the historical context of what we're talking about. Throughout the world, which is what Rocco was saying and what Anne was saying about other countries, throughout the world, the issue of central bank autonomy is central, pardon that pun, to the political debate about where our money comes from. And that is being ignored by the press, it's being ignored by the politicians, and from all three parties, NDP and the Liberals and the Conservatives, they all believe, it's a belief, they have no data, no empirical evidence to support it, they believe that the Bank of Canada should be allowed to operate autonomously, and they have absolutely no thinking to go over to the fiscal side, which is they think the government should do. So the Bank of Canada should be autonomous, monetary policy is theirs, fiscal policy is the government, the fiscal policy should belong to the government. And what happens is the fiscal position of the government is affected hugely by the monetary policies of the government. And I can give you examples of that. Current amount of interest we pay on the debt is $25 billion. And as the guy who was repairing my windows the other day said, every year, and it's been more than that, it's been as high as 40, 50, 60 billion dollars a year that we pay in interest. And who gets that? These are people who are well off. And yet you have politicians who are saying we're concerned about basic income guarantees, we're worried about those kinds of issues. And in fact, what's happening is that they're ignoring a source of, it's a source of money, and it's a huge loss of our money to interest to the very well off. I think Linda would like to ask a question.
But before Linda does, I just want to just clarify or modify something that Herb, so that people don't get misled. On a legal plane, the bank, under the Act of Parliament, is not autonomous.
Right.
The shares are held in trust by the Minister of Finance for Her Majesty the Queen, which in constitutional terms is just It's just flowery language for the people of Canada. If there's a dispute on any policy of the bank between the governor and the Minister of Finance, the legislation clearly provides that the Minister of Finance can, with the approval of Governor and Council, which is Cabinet, direct the governor to do what the Minister of Finance wants him to do. The bank is not autonomous. It reports to Parliament. It is one of the. It's the only public central bank in the G8 or G20. Very few countries have public central banks. China does, to their credit, and a few other countries do, but nobody in Europe has. Sorry?
Iran.
And Iran, but other central banks are private banks that are dressed as a pretense of public banks, but they're not public banks, they're private banks, even though they're central banks. So I'm sorry.
So in
Thank you
other
for doing
words,
that.
in other words, what you're saying is that by not utilizing the Bank of Canada, the government has turned over the responsibility for Canadians, for Canada's economy, to the world bankers, the Bank of International Settlements,
Well,
that sort of thing?
That's what we pled, and that is a fact. And that's where the most flagrant constitutional violation of the government's policy since 1974. They've chosen not to exercise one of the core central purposes of the creation of the bank itself. And that leads to the doctrine of abdication of sovereignty and governing. That's a constitutional violation. A government cannot refuse to implement legislation from Parliament. You can change it, revoke it, but they can't turn a parliamentary scheme into an appendix. That's a constitutional violation. Sorry, Linda.
Yeah, I just think it'd be helpful if you kind of outlined what the case is.
Well, the case was.
Or what-
at this
sorry,
stage,
what the
I'm
case
sorry.
was.
Well, basically, the case was a challenge to the government of Canada since 1974 refusing to utilize the interest-free or low-interest provisions allowed under the Bank of Canada to lend the federal government up to 1/3 of its annual budget and the provincial governments up to 1/4 interest-free, so long as it was repaid in the next fiscal year. But historically, the way it worked was it would be lent and repaid and relent perpetually according to the needs of the governments. Since 1974, when we joined the Bank of International Settlement, there was a resolution and a direction that central banks were not to lend governments money for infrastructure or any other purpose at preferential or no interest rates. And our bank followed suit. So what were they doing? They were following suit to the interests of private bankers when our bank is a public bank in trust for the people. So the case sought a declaration that this led to several constitutional violations. The other part of the challenge that didn't really get a lot of play and people misunderstand, that goes hand in glove with that, is the budgetary process, whereby when they calculate anticipated revenues and deficit, they do so after calculating the anticipated refunded the tax credits back to the tax base, which is a breach of the doctrine of no taxation without representation. What happens is, I give an example, just a simple example in the pleadings. The government will say, we have an anticipated spending needs of 280 billion. We have anticipated revenue of 240. We need to borrow 40 billion. Well, that's not true, because in the anticipated revenue, they deduct the anticipated money they would have had, but for the tax credits, they're kicking back to the tax base. Why is that important? If MPs were equipped with that, and the public were equipped with that, and knew that we may be pulling in 320 or 350 billion, we'd say, well, hang on a second, how about shaving the credits where we can, as opposed to running a deficit budget? And that is a constitutional requirement that the MPs have in their arsenal, and people have the right to petition their MPs with respect to taxation. And that right to no taxation without representation goes back to the Magna Carta.
Can you just go back though before 74?
Right.
and describe exactly what is in the Bank of Canada Act
Yeah.
that makes it clear that the bank can do what you're saying, and how that worked in terms of public
Well,
finance.
Section 18 makes it clear, and from 1938 to 1974, that mechanism was used to build the Trans-Canada Highway, the St. Lawrence Seaway, to pay our World War II debt, which no other country paid that as quickly as we did. And if you recall, for those of us who are not old like Herb, but even youngsters like me, the proliferation of the building of universities across this country was financed through the Bank of Canada. Interest-free loan provisions.
But it wouldn't have been a direct loan to the universities or anything like that. The government would borrow the money from the Bank of Canada and other sources, and then use that money for those kinds of expenditures, the St. Lawrence Seaway, airports, hospitals. There was a money flow that came from the Bank of Canada through the budgeting process.
Right.
And if I may just do one, you and I do these little dances now and then about correction. We joined the Bank for International Settlements in 1970, and what you should know is that the Bank of Canada holds $400 million approximately in shares in the Bank for International Settlements. And that's in their budget, that's in their annual statements.
Following the question, like for people that weren't around here back in 1974, I got so many questions like how did this law came to pass in 1974? And
There was no law passed.
it was, so how it happened, because I tried to find information and there is almost nothing.
There was no laws passed. The laws were ignored by the executive, by the government. That's what happened. And that's constitutionally flagrant, because the government does not have the right to ignore an act of parliament, nor its purpose. All right. Joyce?
Does anyone know who is actually, or what legislation is going to be overseeing the Canada Infrastructure Bank? It doesn't seem to be covered by the Bank of Canada Act.
We don't know yet. We're still waiting.
Bill C-44. It's
It's
the
the
omnibus
omnibus.
budget bill. The details of the CIB, the initial details are in Bill C-44.
If it would be helpful to you, I can give you a handout that shows dramatically what happened to the debt.
Can I just ask Rocco, though,
Yeah.
give this history
Right.
from 38 to 74, do they dispute the accuracy of that? Is that in contention?
Well, on the motion to strike, they're required to take those facts as proven, and the other side, no, doesn't dispute that, no. There's no dispute of the facts and the chronology. And so those facts, it's the legal import that they dispute, and they say, my clients didn't have the right to bring the challenge. It's interesting, in the first round on the motion to strike, the judge, we lost at the lowest level, and then on judge of the federal court, we won the appeal and said the declaratory relief as to the statutory interpretation and constitutionality can proceed. We had also a charter challenge and damages, and that got struck subject to amendment. We appealed that small portion. The government appealed that ruling to the Federal Court of Appeal, and the Federal Court of Appeal dismissed the appeal and cross-appeal, saying, no, the lower judge's ruling is good, proceed. We filed an amended statement of claim. But from the time we initially brought the case to the time that it came back for a second motion to strike, the case had gone viral on the internet. So, I say this with respect, and I pleaded in the second appeal that the judge applied the law properly on the first motion, and then it was the same judge who heard the second motion to strike when it went back down, and he effectively overruled his first ruling and the Court of Appeal that had endorsed his first ruling. And then our appeal to the Court of Appeal on the second round was dismissed, and then the Supreme Court didn't seek leave. So nothing changed between the first and second ruling except an awareness of the issue.
But, okay, so, and technicalities and things, but they do not dispute the
No, they
basic,
do
they're
not.
not trying to
No.
dispute the basic facts.
No, they're saying that we don't have the right to seek this declaratory relief.
And do they, have they given any accounting of what changed in 74, why the change in
No,
74?
because that's what they're trying to avoid, you see. The motion to strike was necessary for them to be able to sweep it under the rug, because they would only have to do that in filing their statement of defense. And that's why they fought this on that technicality for 6 years. Because if they have to file a statement of defense, it's clear that none of this is up for dispute. It's historically factual. And the other thing that they keep, every time there's a request of the Minister of Finance in the last 30 years for interest or low interest loans for human infrastructure, for infrastructure and human capital expenses, the exact same letter has been issued by dozens of ministers of finance. And the letter says, well, we've considered this, but the banking community, one, wouldn't like it, and secondly, it would lead to inflation. Okay, now the banking community won't like it, meaning the private bankers in Europe. And the fallacy of inflation is this, and we pleaded this in the pleading, between 1938 and 1974, the average inflation rate was half what it's been since 74 to now by not using this mechanism. Also, I should say that there was a research paper that was commissioned by, we don't know who, at the Parliamentary Library, and the research paper at the Parliamentary Library that was conducted and was floated to me anonymously, I don't know who mailed it to me, basically looked at our statement of claim and asked questions. Are they right on this? And consistently the answer that came back said, yes. The only thing that the research paper disagreed with was they questioned whether or not the Bank of Canada could actually issue interest-free loans, but they said they certainly could issue the loans at the most preferential overnight rate, which at the time was 0.25%. Still better than the 4% and 5% we paid to commercial banks.
Could I just add something here? There is so much to be discussed here. There is just so much to deal with. But of interest, I think, is this. We, in Bill 143 in the Bank of Canada Act was a separate bill to empower the government to fund, to lend money at the municipal level. That was on the books from 1938 until guess when? 1974, when everything went. Now, various members of our own group, Paul Hellyer, who should have access to information if anybody does, no one has been able to find any kind of record of how that happened.
The only thing was that Gerald Bowie said that we were going to operate with monetarism in the 70s, and that was a philosophical economic argument based on no empirical data. He basically said we're going to use monetarism, and if people want to really get a good handle on it, Google Canada's surpluses and deficits from 1963 to 2015, and it's a beautiful interactive website. This is a screenshot of what it looks like, but it shows that starting in the mid-70s, things started to change dramatically, and you have to ask, what changed? What's different? Why did we suddenly run these huge deficits and surpluses in different ways? And it's adjusted even to 2015 dollars, so you can compare the whole time. And then the other thing that you can do is you can look at the actual debt growth, and it took off exponentially in the mid-70s. But we didn't build more universities than we were before that. We didn't build more highways, we didn't build more St. Lawrence seaways, Trans-Canada pipelines. We didn't do anything that much different. We didn't change much. And yet our debt took off like a rocket. It became exponentially higher, and is still growing the same way. And the new Canada Infrastructure Bank, they're borrowing another $35 billion, I think it is, to seed that. Joyce might know the number better than I do. But again, it's constant exponential growth due to the compound interest. And when you borrow from the Bank of Canada, there's no compound interest. It doesn't appear to be a compound interest because they pay the amount of interest. The government pays the interest that is owed to the Bank of Canada at the end of, through the year, and then the Bank of Canada returns it to the government. So there's no exponential growth to the debt. The borrowing from the Bank of Canada ends the debt growth in terms of the problems fiscally on the fiscal side of the ledger. You probably can talk about it better than I can, Rocco. Well, the only other thing I was going to do was show you the other chart, which is the growth of the debt. From 1917, you can see that it's flat. When it turns up, it's again in the mid-70s. There's an example of the exponential growth in the debt. And these two things go hand in hand, so it's really worth looking at. Anybody who wants copies, you're welcome to have those, and I can provide you with more references for that. Yeah.
Question? There's a question.
During these 5.5 years, did you ever hear even a rumor that the Bank for International Settlements was contacting the federal government about your lawsuit?
We wouldn't know, but the requisition of the parliamentary research paper tells me that something was afloat. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know. And as I said, I didn't get wind of it. It was sent to me anonymously, a copy of it. And the other thing I want to say about the infrastructure bank that's on the table now, yeah, I'm one of the few lawyers, if not the only lawyer, who 3 times has challenged the constitutionality of trade accords from 1997 to the present. First with the MAI in '97 with Connie Fogel and her lawyer and her committee out west, and then the FTAA in 2001, and now with Paul Hellyer and CETA. And my analysis of these trade treaties and structures is that the infrastructure bank is just a logical hand-in-glove mechanism that makes it look like it's an institution, a mechanism that's going to assist Canadians, but it's simply there to facilitate the financing at our expense of the implementation of these trade treaties. Pure and simple.
A follow-up question. The Labour Party in England, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, is also advancing a similar infrastructure bank that will also leverage, use federal money to leverage private sector money for infrastructure. I can't see any difference between the CIB and whatever Corbyn is proposing, yet the left is very much in favor of Corbyn's proposal.
Well,
And I don't understand.
I think it's back to that problem that I was mentioning earlier about the independence of the central banks. And that is has been a conflict, a philosophical conflict for many, many decades. Should it be independent or should it be accountable to democratic processes in Parliament? And that debate goes on. It's been going on. If you look at the history of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, it's an independent, autonomous bank with no accountability to anybody anywhere in the world. And yet it now includes the members, all the central banks in the world basically belong to it. And as I said before, Canada owns $400 million in shares. Our governor of the Bank of Canada sits on one of its major committees. And so that committee is the one that calls the shots for all the other banks in the world. So there's an idea here, a philosophical notion that's underpinning all this as opposed to just the legalities. We have legal things in place that should be allowing us to use the Bank of Canada effectively, but because people are choosing not to do it, out of that philosophical belief that the bank should be autonomous, you're not getting that. Now, if you look at the leadership of the NDP right now, Guy Caron and Charlie Angus are both opposed to using the Bank of Canada. They've told me that personally. They're both in favor of it being autonomous and independent, Guy Caron's exact words. Nikki Ashton and Pat Stokren are both in favor of using the Bank of Canada. And I don't know where Peter Julian is. He and I had a conversation about it, but he wasn't sure yet. And I don't know where Singh is in terms of his position on it. So we've got another leadership race going on with a major political party, going back to your question of left versus right and so on, where they've been drinking the economic Kool-Aid for so long on the independence of the Bank of Canada that they can't conceive that there's another way to do it, even though it's enshrined in legislation.
But and maybe this is my bias as a lawyer, but, and more recently with the experience with Paul Hellier's challenge to the CETA, when they finally forced it, they put it through Parliament. You know, you have a 19-page treaty, which they purport to debate in the course of a week. Let's face it, these MPs, there's a human dynamic, and Paul Hellier has spoken about this publicly. The MPs don't want to look stupid, and they look stupid if they try to engage in discussing a treaty that's 1,900 pages in a matter of 2 weeks. So they parrot and belch the party line. It's good for Canadians, it's good for Canadians. They don't have the first clue of what they're talking about. You know, so when we talk about democracy, that's why when Lawrence, you asked that question, it's a joke, you know, and so this is why constitutional requirements are important, because at this level, Parliament doesn't function. It does not function. You cannot read, digest, and debate a 1,900 text in half a year and put it through committee, let alone, you know, the several weeks it was in the House of Commons and the Senate. It's a joke. You know, I might as well give it to my 7-year-old kids.
Wait till you read about the infrastructure bank and the provision that I mean, that's one of the complaints against it that come out again and again during the debate. It's impossible to deal with this. You buried it in 300 pages of legislation, and you give us, I think they're talking about 2 hours in committee or something to deal with that. There are so many things involved here. Can I just take a couple of minutes to just throw out a couple of things? First of all, from my point of view, neoliberal inspired power, corporate power, has used two strategies to assume total control. One is debt, and the other one is free trade, so-called. If you read the NAFTA, even someone without any legal understanding reading the NAFTA had to see that it was less than free and more than trade. And we issued a press release at that time with that title. The NDP, those people in the NDP don't know their own history.
Exactly, don't remember the Regina Manifesto.
Yeah. In 1925, J.S. Wordsworth was campaigning for a central bank. We didn't have a central bank until 35, 34. And he was campaigning for a public central bank. And at that time he said, in trying to do this, we will discover whether Parliament is sovereign, whether the people are sovereign, or whether we have already had our freedom filched from it without our even being aware of it. Carroll Quigley wrote a book, a tome called Tragedy and Hope, and in the very front, on a page by itself, at least in my volume, Carroll Quigley explains that the plan existed back in the 20s to dismiss government by getting control of the central bank. I've been reading a book by a British economist, a woman whose name is Mary Mellor, and the title of her book says it all. This is our choice. This is where we are. The title of her book is Debt or Democracy. And there are so many other things. For one thing, the people with money are running out of places to put it and use it, and these infrastructure, this idea of building infrastructure all over the place is a fabulous idea. And then you go on collecting. It means decades of debt, tolls and user fees, and all of the rest of that. And in Debt or Democracy, Miller develops a wonderful argument to the effect that money is public and social. And she talks about the difference between commercially created money and money created through a public central bank. We really need to get people to understand the truth about money. I won't take any, I don't want to take up all the time. Here's another one.
This is the latest book that I found on it. I love her writing. There's some great YouTube videos. It's called Donut Economics. It's not an ode to Tim Hortons or anything like that. Or Starbucks. It is about a different economic system that 21st century economists should be looking at, and it's incredibly comprehensive and in-depth, and I'm going to encourage people to look at this and read it and study it. And going back to your earlier question, Lawrence, I think this is where we need to go politically and economically in the world, not just Canada, in the world. We'll start here. But it's worth taking a look at, and I'd encourage people to do that.
I have a quick question from someone that's on Facebook here. Derek asks, what in your opinion would need to happen to implement the changes COMER is fighting for?
I'm sorry. I didn't.
Two things.
I quite hear all of that.
What in your opinion would need to happen to implement the changes COMER is looking for?
I didn't
Or
get the
fighting
first
for.
part of that. I'm sorry. I don't know why.
What in your opinion
Oh.
would need to happen to implement the changes COMER is fighting for?
Education. I am very optimistic. I'm very excited about the springboard that I see the infrastructure bank, the proposed infrastructure bank is. This, if people really understand what's going on with this proposed infrastructure bank, we will have a level of understanding unprecedented. I think it's an unprecedented opportunity for COMER. But what must happen, the reason I'm optimistic is that the level of awareness, largely thanks to the lawsuit of this whole matter today. 10 years ago, we would have thought we were in seventh heaven. This is an opportunity of a lifetime, but it's going to involve a very vigorous effort to bring people together to learn the truth about money. Joseph Stiglitz has written a book called I've forgotten the title. I'm sorry. I'm a senior's moment. The Price of Inequality. The Price of Inequality. And in that book, Joseph Stiglitz says, say what you like. Central banks are public, and they should be operating in the best interests of the people they are supposed to serve. And one of the things that Mellon does well is to show the difference between a money system that is controlled for profit by commercial creators of money, as opposed to the situation when government creates money. And you just made numerous comments about that. So what needs to happen? More people need to learn the truth. And it's so simple. That's part of our problem. Who can believe it?
Some specific things that they can do. I'd like to make a
Yeah,
comment
well,
about some specifics.
yeah.
One of them is every MP sitting has received a book called Beyond Banksters, Resisting the New Feudalism. And people in the public can go to their MPs. They don't even have to have read the book, but they can go to their MPs and say, have you read the book? If you haven't, then would you please do that? And can we have a meeting and talk about what we can do in the future? So there's some very specific action things that I think the public could do on that regard. I think the press needs to take a look at this. And we have, I'm not sure I'm always popular to say this, but one of our members has termed the new infrastructure bank as the public assets pilfering bank. It's about taking public assets, what belongs to all of us, the civil commons, privatizing it, putting a fence around it, and charging admission to get on the other side of the fence. That's really what it's all about. It's tollways, it's about paying higher parking fees at the hospital, because then the parking lots will be owned by these large funders and so on. So it's understanding that we are commodifying as much of the civil commons, which belongs to all of us, as the people with the financial means can accomplish. Linda, you have a question?
Yeah, just to go back to the case. So this change happens in 74. Your argument is an abdication of a role that was legitimately outlined in the Bank of Canada Act. They stopped doing that in 74.
That's right, it's an abdication of governance, right?
And we have no record at all of, like, apart from why they stopped it, do we have a record saying that they stopped it, or what's?
Well, part of what we were seeking in the lawsuit, because the governor has a duty, it's a public bank, has a duty to report to Parliament. We were saying that the minutes of the BIS are confidential and cannot be released by anybody. Well, how do you report to Parliament as the governor of the Bank of Canada without releasing the tenure of the meetings and what's decided, which you're implementing? And so that was part of the challenge, was to have release all these minutes in 74. And so we don't know.
But wouldn't
And the
there
Bank
be
of Canada-
minutes in which they, of Bank of Canada meetings or something,
The Bank of Canada Act stipulates that the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Bank of Canada shall meet on a regular basis and discuss these matters. But we never hear what those discussions are about. We don't see the minutes. I think the lawsuit, I was going to raise this in another meeting, but basically I think the lawsuit could have compelled the release of some of that information over time.
It was part of the lawsuit to
Okay.
compel that information.
And
Yeah.
did we join the Bank of International Settlements in 74? Is
No, we
that-
joined it in
70.
1970.
But the implementation was started
But
in early
I just want to add
74.
one point of interest here, which is exactly what you're looking for. In 1974, it was when Canada joined the BIS's first Basel Committee. That was what started this, and it was them agreeing to the recommendations of the first Basel Committee that started all of this.
And
So
do we
that's what happened
have
in 74.
something, some document showing that, or?
All we have are the fact that we own shares in the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, and it's in the annual statement of the Bank of Canada annual report, and it varies as to whether it's $400 million that we own in shares or whether it's 405 million or 390. It depends on the exchange rate at the time, how they report the accounting of that, but it's roughly 400 million.
So-
No, but we have historical documents that Trudeau, announced that we're joining this BIS.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, we do
Oh,
have it.
okay.
Yeah, those historical documents are there, yeah.
But not specifically relating that to the change about how we use the Bank of Canada. Nobody ever, like you mentioned something about Gerald Bowie
Right.
said we went to monetarism, but there's no
That was an
specific.
announcement that he made that was accepted at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not gonna be a statement that says from henceforth, we're gonna refuse to
Well, no,
apply
there
an
might
academic-
actually be a statement
There
that
might
would
be.
disguise that in
Yeah,
some
yeah, yeah.
supposedly positive
But
way.
it's not a disputed fact.
Okay. And you're saying that you're arguing that's an abdication of our sovereignty or our, what?
Well, there's a constitutional doctrine that says quite clearly that the executive cannot refuse to govern and implement an act of Parliament. And that's both in the letter of the law and the purpose of the legislation. The primary purpose of this very legislation was to do what they're refusing it to do. That's an abdication. That's throwing the supremacy of Parliament by the executive down the toilet, which is a constitutional violation. I'm putting it in simple terms. But when the executive overtakes Parliament, it's 1688. And the English Civil War, that's the English Bill of Rights. That's how far back it goes. You can't dispense with Parliament.
I guess they could give some kind of counter argument about the inflation thing or
sure.
something, but you're saying they haven't even responded.
No, they haven't responded. And because if they had to respond, it would be problematic.
Because then we could get into
Well,
a
you
public
get into-
debate.
Well, you're going to get into an evidentiary trial over what they're saying comes out of their mouth or somewhere else. So.
I'd like to make another point in response to the question that you asked. And that is that if we could simply help people to understand the truth about money creation, how money is created, that would be an enormous step forward. Galbraith, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith said, the process by which money is created is so simple that it repels the mind.
The mind is repelled.
The mind is repelled.
And that quote appears at the Parliamentary Library page about money creation. There's a whole article there that people can read about, and that quote is there. The process by which banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled.
Randall Wray, the economist Randall Wray, has just stated the absurdity of it in such a way that I think is tremendously effective because you feel it. You have to laugh in spite of yourself. He said, our problems stem from a lack of something that is created out of nothing. And it's not easy to get your head around that.
Say the word Clifford Douglas, does that say anything to anybody here?
I'm not sure it's Clifford.
Clifford Douglas, Economic Democracy, wrote in 1919.
The social credit.
C.H. Douglas.
No,
No.
C.H. Douglas, yeah, sure.
Yeah. That's social credit ideas. Yeah, there's a relationship, but I haven't looked at it. None of us at this table, I think, have actually spent a lot of time looking at that material.
But COMER has been looked very favorably on social credit, and we get social credit literature from New Zealand on a regular basis.
I think it's worth pointing out that we are part of an international movement for monetary reform. There's an organization called IMMR, and it represents Positive Money in England, which is a very large organization. They've actually had a parliamentary debate about the issue of money creation. There's Positivo Dinero from Spain. They're also very active. Switzerland is going to have a referendum on the issue of who creates the money. Should it be the private sector or should it be the government? Germany has some activity going on in this regard. And when you start looking at the history, and this is an important point, when you look at the history of central banks, they have been incredibly successful. One of the things that we've done in the neoliberal age of austerity that I think we live in is to suppress the history, the good news stories. There's some good news stories out there about the central banks and what they've accomplished. And if you start looking for that information, you start to say, holy cow, the press spin on this isn't accurate. We're not actually getting the true goods, the true story about how central banks have been incredibly effective and helpful, not just here in Canada from 38 to 74, which was amazing, but also in other countries. And if you start to look at that, you'll find that history and you'll find positive effects all the way through the world, all around the world, including China today.
How do you reconcile the idea, because we know that right now you're fighting essentially the government to get, for example, the minutes, but at the same time, you want to put the power in the same government to issue the money and all of that. So there is like people that might have they feel like the same government is bashing you, is not releasing the information that we should have publicly, is not releasing the minutes, but then the same government will have the control of the money.
Love the paradox. Thanks for pointing out the paradox.
But see, you're making the same mistake that they make in a lot of countries, including Canada today. You equate the government with parliament. And this is why I say we've slid into a quiet dictatorship. This is no different from Latin America in the 70s here. Our government thinks it's parliament. And there's the reality that in a majority government, and the Supreme Court of Canada has made this point, yeah, the executive, the government is, we're not asking the government to do what the government does. We're asking the government to do what the legislation, parliament, says it should do. And there's a difference.
Thank you.
Question from Joyce. Oh, sorry, you want to respond to it?
Also, This is why we're so keenly interested in electoral reform. What we've got going for us at the moment are 3 strings of the same team. And for years, they've been getting away with just replacing one because people don't know what else to do. So we also, if it's not good enough to just change this little thing, patch up that little thing. We have to see how all these things are connected and recognize that we have to have electoral reform in order to make fundamental change, deep fundamental change, which is absolutely necessary, because if we don't, we're destroying the very planet we depend on, for one thing.
You had a question, Joyce?
Yeah, let's, I don't know if, just tell me to be quiet if this is off track, but do you know Daniel Esterlin,
Oh, yeah.
foremost authority on Bilderberg?
Yes.
Bilderberg is meeting this weekend.
In Washington.
He said that the goal of Bilderberg now is to override all central banks. So central banks will become unnecessary because there will be a higher power making the decisions. So that's another reason why, if we don't have control of our public bank, we're in deep trouble.
Conspiracy theory. Well,
Well, see, as a lawyer, I'm gonna sit here and, it's never the intention of this lawsuit, nor could it be, to talk about different economic systems, different economic theories. This is why nation states, if we're not gonna abandon the model of sovereign states, have constitutions. And this is why you have to enforce your constitution. Otherwise, you have foreign interests, private interests, who are engaging in a de facto economic coup of your sovereignty. And the only point of analysis, whether you like the system or don't like the system, which for me as a lawyer is irrelevant, is your constitutional framework, and to make sure that your constitutional framework is respected and enforced. That's the only way a people has control over their own destiny. Because if you try to battle the world forces at large, well, my mother always used to say, you want to make God laugh, make a big plan. Right? I mean, others have tried, from Caesar down to Hitler. I'm not here, and with all due respect to my clients, I'm not here to answer that kind of question, because I don't care what they're doing. As a Canadian, as a constitutional lawyer, I care that my government respect the Constitution, or else. That's the starting point. So you control, you have to respect the framework that you're living under locally, and not try to control the world, as it were. Because the people who control the world are the ones with the means to control the world. So.
You were mentioning that, I think Canada's the only, in the Bank for International Settlements, Canada's the only central bank that's publicly owned, is that right?
No, Jim.
I would disagree with that. I think there are others as well.
Which
So,
ones?
Bank of England is still public in parts of it, and there are other banks.
Bank of France.
The Bank of France is one. I know that, Adam, you've got a better handle on some of these things than I do.
Yeah, but Rocco kind of alluded to it earlier. While they are technically public, only Canada has the in law the ability for Parliament to override the bank. So it's not that the other ones aren't public. They are public in that they aren't private. They don't have private shareholders, but they aren't beholden to any elected authority.
And that's the key.
No, I guess I'm trying to figure out, is the implication of your lawsuit that Canada shouldn't even belong to the BIS?
Well, part of the thing that was pleaded was that the governor of the Bank of Canada and the executive of this country doesn't have the constitutional jurisdiction to have our public bank march to the tune of private bankers, of course.
Okay.
That's part of the abdication of governance.
So
Yeah,
that would,
that was part
we
of it.
shouldn't be
We
part of the
shouldn't be there,
BIS at
no,
all.
no, unless we're all with other public central banks, in which case you would have a multilateral banking treaty, that's different.
Right, and you'd also presumably have some kind of public minutes. and-
Transparency, yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be nation-to-nation treaties. That's not what this is. And it goes hand in glove, as I said. That's why people misunderstand, trade treaties. Is they say, well, we have human rights treaties. Yeah, but human rights treaties are nation-to-nation that accrue to the benefit of all the citizens of those nations, not private investor to nation. There's a huge difference.
Can I just add, only 60 banks are members of the BIS. You can find their list. There's only 60 banks.
Yeah.
For example, and you can see which countries are under attack. Their central bank is not a member of the BIS. You can look right through the list of who's being attacked. So it's like,
Maybe it's Syria.
Mhm.
And I believe the Central Bank of Ghana has just been declared autonomous by legislation in that country, which is going in the opposite direction that COMER would have advised. We do not think that the central banks ever should be allowed to function autonomously and be subject to the whims of either the Bank for International Settlements or the private banking investment sector. The central bank of every country should be accountable to the people of that country through the laws and the Constitution.
Canada's situation is such, as so many points have just made, that is why I think Canada has a special role to play in the world. I think we have a special obligation to stand up and see this through. And I'm very encouraged that, for example, at least with the proposed infrastructure bank, I think they've gone a little too far. And there's a negative ripple going on out there. People know, and they're starting to say, hey, wait a minute. And that's not usual. They hoped there'd be no discussion.
12-year-old girls even.
There's a beautiful video now with Poilievre, I can't say his name properly, I apologize. But he's a Conservative MP who was speaking in the House of Commons about the infrastructure bank and called them corporate welfare from this new Canada Infrastructure Bank. And so I think it's interesting that the issue is starting to cut across different party lines, as it should. And every MP should be concerned about the thrust of the last 40 years of the central bank becoming more autonomous and independent and subject to the whims of the Bank for International Settlements and the private sector. Every MP and every party should be concerned about this. And so we should be, where we're going in the future, will be to encourage citizens across the country to go to their MPs and to discuss these kinds of issues with them.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say before I don't say anything else is that in the last 6 years while we've been doing this case, often I would get asked the question, especially when we started this under the Harper government, why doesn't Parliament simply remove the provision allowing the Bank of Canada to issue interest-free loans to the governments? And that would be simple. They could do that. And if they did that, nobody could have a constitutional objection. And the answer to that is, there's two answers to that. The small one is that they wouldn't want to debate it in Parliament and let people know. But that, to me, is the smaller issue. The bigger reason is it's much like somebody having an affair with their ex-spouse. They know that this mechanism worked. There were good days with this stuff. And God forbid, if the international financial system collapses, we're the only ones around poised to get out of it by simply going back to the old relationship with the bank. But it's dishonest. Because if they really believe that the bank shouldn't be doing this, we'll change the law. Pass it through Parliament and change it.
So in other words, the Bank of Canada is the government's mistress.
Right.
That was a neat.
All right, so that gets into really interesting metaphors if we extend that one.
Something else that you have been pressing for, and that is people getting to their MP. Adam,
Yeah.
this, by the way, is Adam Smith.
We have Adam Smith working with us.
No irony there. When Adam found out that this debate was coming up, in no time at all, he wrote a marvelous letter to his MP and to the he sent it to the Prime Minister, and that letter is going to be published in the next issue of the ER, which will come out, heaven help me, before the end of June if I'm lucky. Because it's just a model, and it shows what can, and Adam's very able to do this kind of thing. So I would recommend that you go to the COMER.org site and have a look at his model letter. But this is certainly something that everybody can imagine if they were bombarded by millions of letters, millions of calls. We're not powerless.
10% of the federal budget goes in interest payments to people who are already well off. It is part of the inequality in how our government, while it says it wants to deal with inequality, fails to do so. When you're sending $25 billion in interest payments, they call it debt service charges if you look in the budget, to people who are already well off, then I think we've got a problem, and we're participating in the very problem that many of the governments say they want to resolve. And they can't do it as long as the money is going to that purpose. And yes, some of it goes to pension funds. My pension fund is likely invested in bonds from the Bank of Canada, from the finance government through the Bank of Canada. But that doesn't make it right, because it's never actually been debated in the House of Commons that we should have this social program for the rich. In a sense, the way in which the interest payments are being managed is a social program for the people who are already well off. And that's not correct. It's just not the way we should be doing things. And I think that's the biggest problem that the MPs have never figured. If you ask your MP, how much do we pay in interest on the debt? Most of them can't answer. I've asked, and so I know for sure that most of them can't tell you how much interest we pay on the debt. And they can't tell you that it amounts to well over $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion since the mid-70s. And so when you start looking at that kind of money and what it could have been done for people in this country, for health care, for vision care, for dental care, for day care, we have all kinds of programs that are not being funded properly because we're paying a huge amount of interest to people who are already well off through the interest debt service charges mechanism.
Herb has raised a fundamental question that has been questioned in days prior very seriously, but submerged and submerged and submerged. And that is the question of earned income as opposed to unearned income, rent. And that's something that we need to do a lot of thinking about. There are a couple of things. One of the things that's helping us greatly is the monstrous bailout after 2007, 2008 meltdown. Because I keep coming across a reference to this now. If the government could suddenly come up, and it's a monstrous amount of money, and hand it over to the guys who created the problem, why can't they create money to do the right things? I want to quote Graham Towers because this is our core belief. This is the bottom line. If Graham
Is this the back of my shirt?
Oh,
Is this the back of my shirt?
there you go.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it. There you go.
Does somebody want to read it out for our viewers?
Anything physically possible and desirable can be made financially possible, period. That's the truth. He confirmed that when he appeared before a commission in 1939. War broke out, and people were saying, how are we going to fund a war? How can we afford a war? We're just getting out of the Depression. And he chuckled and said, I will create the money. That's what banks do. Steel mills create steel, banks create money.
Very quickly, on an evidentiary basis, then, and we pled this in the statement of claim. We cited the Obama and Harper bailout to the banks in the crash, and that was, I think it was 700 or 800 billion by Obama. But then the Harper government outright, gave 60 billion. But then it was later revealed that they gave another 160 billion through assuming the toxic CHC. I forget the
CMHC.
mortgages, and so you're talking about $1 trillion. $1 trillion in an 18-month span with absolutely zero impact on inflation, and they're touting the inflationary line. This is absurd.
At any rate,
Okay, so should I start charging your rent now, Ann? Or? I'm sorry, go ahead.
So one final question before we end this press conference. What are the plans for COMER in the future now that the Bank of Canada case has been turfed out of court?
Well, before she answers that, it wasn't turfed out of court. They barred the doors, not allowing the case to go in.
Right,
It
exactly.
doesn't mean it's not going to go back in at some point.
Excuse me,
Okay.
now that they've refused to hear the merits of the case.
So,
What's the future for COMER?
the future, I think the future for COMER is very bright. We're in touch now with people around the world. We've had the most amazing input as Rocco, is that your name? as Rocco was saying. Rocco and I were invited to speak at a meeting in Montreal some time ago. And Rocco went as our lawyer, I went as a biological plaintiff in the case. That meeting was translated into French, and very shortly after, someone from
Spain,
Spain,
Positivo de Niro.
with the Positivo de Niro, got in touch with us very excitedly and explained to us that primarily he wanted us to know that they had translated that meeting into Spanish, and they wanted us to know how it can be accessed so that that could be spread around. My favorite quotation, my favorite response came from the Netherlands. In all the correspondence that we've had, came from the Netherlands. They quoted Nietzsche, who said, and those who were seen to be dancing were thought insane by those who could not hear the music. I praised Occupy. It really turned up the volume. And that's what we have to do. And it's going to take COMER can't solve this problem. It's going to take a massive movement for fundamental change. And yeah, we're going to be busy.
Yeah, to start with, to be more specific, Lawrence, to your question, we have a meeting this afternoon of the members to look at that very question. What are our next steps? What are we going to do? I think most of us agree that it's a combination of education and political action, and we'll be embarking on specific plans around that. I've kind of alluded to some of the possibilities. We've been doing them already. I know that Anne and I have been to different meetings around the province. I was in Charlotte Lake recently, Anne and myself and Margaret and Judy, I think you were there. We went down to Hamilton. The Council of Canadians has passed a motion about this, saying that the Bank of Canada should be used to fund infrastructure. So we've got one of the largest organizations in the country that's already supporting that. They have reach into many parts of the country and are going to be part of this campaign. The other organizations in the country that are supporting us, we hope to make linkages with them, because none of them can accomplish what they would like to accomplish without considering the issue of money. It is the lifeblood of our bodies, in a sense. Blood is the lifeblood for us. Money is the lifeblood of our economy. Some of us wish it were different, but the reality is that you can't accomplish anything in social programs, medical programs, health infrastructure without money. And we need to start looking at where it comes from. We can't be ignoring this particular issue.
One more point I'd like to make along that line, and that is that in the debate that took place in the House, Elizabeth May pointed out the distinction between funding and financing. We need public funding of public commons. Instead, we're losing the commons. What will be left? Money is a commons, and they've stolen it from us. It was privatized, and that allowed them to monopolize the money supply, and that allowed them to buy the media, the government, academe, and here in the sir.
Rich or poor, it's good to have money.
Linda, you were gonna
Yeah,
ask?
well, just your
Sorry.
point about the Supreme Court barring the door.
Yeah.
Like you made the point, that's not a comment on the case at
Right.
all. Do you want to speculate on do they just not want to touch such a hot potato, or what do you
It's
think?
not uncommon for the Supreme Court, first time on an issue, to say no, and then it comes back. You know, I did a case called Baker, 1999, that was featured by Amanda Lang in the piece she did on the Bank of Canada. And you know, we sought leave on that case. We got turfed in the federal court 27 times before we finally got leave. And when it got to the Supreme Court, we won. I sought leave in 2000 on the constitutionality of the security certificates for anti-terrorism under the Immigration Act. And we sought leave multiple times, never got it. And then finally we got leave in Charcouy, and it succeeded. So this is not uncommon. A case often gets leave on the first time around, unfortunately, when the court is itself moved by either the type of issue or the public media around an issue thinking it's important. You know, so assisted suicide, you know, or, that kind of case, right? Where there's already a hyped, and so, but it's not uncommon on a first or second time around, the court says no, and we don't know why they say no. This is why they don't issue reasons, because they don't want to say, because if they give you reasons, then they're in effect having to trench on the merits without trenching on the merits. So they say no. Next time around, if different fact situation, let's say a municipality asks for interest-free money, or a province, and it's refused, then you can see round two.
So
And then-
you see a future potential in this?
Well, either through this or through the trade treaties, depends what they do with the infrastructure bank. You know, we'll have to wait and see. I'm not speaking for my clients to suggest that they're going to initiate, but this is a live issue. They're not the only Canadians interested in this issue, right?
It's across the board.
It's so basically, and often, you know, they have their own docket, they have their own agenda. They may, I'm not speaking for the Supreme Court, but they may think, yeah, there are legal issues here, but this is the kind of case we're going to leave to the government,
Right.
to the political process. They don't want to be seen as trenching on the political process. So there are many different reasons why they would not grant leave on a point in time.
When we applied for leave, did the Crown make a submission around opposing it?
Of course they oppose leave, yeah.
And do you know, I don't think I've ever seen what they stated in their opposition to it.
Well, basically, they simply stated the Federal Court of Appeal was correct, and that's it. And they didn't try to explain how you got two opposite decisions from the same judge, for instance, because that's inexplicable.
I just wanted to bring that out.
inexplicable, you know. So,
I think we have to wrap up pretty soon, so can this be the last one? Are there any other?
Final questions? Yeah.
Yes. Well, of course, guys, you cannot do everything like COMER, so what can we do as citizens of Canada to help you out? Aside of calling our MPs, how do we penetrate into the mainstream media? Because it has been almost a blackout, except like the CBC when they interviewed Rocco. Like, what else can we do? Because sometimes I feel frustrated, and many, I guess, of my friends also, because we're trying to do whatever we can, and sometimes they're not here. What other, with more experience than me, like, what else can we do?
I think it would be really great if the citizens of Canada would start looking at this issue and start getting together with each other and having conversations. Invite us to come and we'll speak to them if we can possibly get there. educate themselves, go to our website. We have a new one that's being developed. It'll be launched sometime in August. So there'll be a new website. There'll be all kinds of opportunity there to take action. There'll be ideas of what they can do there as well. The only ones that you can do, I think, at the moment would be to go to your MP and say, have you read Beyond Banksters? And what did you think of it? So there's some specific little things like that that they can do. It would be really good if they read it and had a conversation. The big problem, though, in going to MPs is that they always check with the finance minister first around what should we say to these voters who are coming in to talk to us. So that isn't a very productive thing. It's far more productive to form groups of people, have conversations with them, and start to talk to the local politicians. There are some mechanisms we're going to have on our website that will explain how to deal with some of these things. So that's one of the things, and I think you've got a comment, Margaret?
Just in terms of the Senate and senators, are some good independent senators who would like to hear the story too, based in Ontario, also Manitoba, who would follow the money, so to speak. So senators as well.
Okay, a comment from
I would like
Judy?
to make
Judy.
Yes, it's Judy. Oh my gosh. Okay, I would like to suggest that you get back to us with what your MP said to you, so that we can put this on the net and they will be accountable, because that's been a big problem so far.
I will
Lack of
record it.
accountability.
Thank you. And for me, this is the most important case in Canadian in the 21st
Yes.
century. At least this is how I see it.
I think that our major challenge now is to work at the community level, public forums, chapters. People are asking us from all over the place, how can we help? How can we form a chapter? We're just struggling. We are a small group.
It's somewhat on the elderly side. Speaking for me, not you.
At any rate, we need to develop programs. We need to help people become able to function in a community group themselves. It's a tremendous task, but these are the kinds of things that we want to attack. We've never felt the need for great numbers, but now the tasks are so numerous. The role of COMER has changed. And we've been doing fairly well at the level of coalition, which is also terribly important. But I think our work at the community level has got to be a really big focus for us now.
Priority.
Can I just end by saying you made a comment about how this is, one of the most important cases. I've been practicing law 29 years, and I only do cases against the government. And I've had more than my fair share of huge, successful wins in the courts. But this case, for me as a lawyer, was by far, leaps and bounds, the most important, profound case that had the most impact on Canadians. And it goes to the core of our constitutional framework and its impact on the money, the way money is handled by our government, and how human capital and infrastructure is addressed. And that was the biggest frustration for me as a lawyer, to having the doors barred, because this case, in my view, is probably more important than all the other cases I've ever done personally as a lawyer. And as I said, I've had more than my fair share of huge successes in my cases. And so people, a lot of my colleagues, when they read about this case, said, why are you bothering with this, a bank case? And I'd have to explain it to them. They thought this was, I was doing this to pay the bills or something, in between doing the bigger, more important case. And I kept telling people, no, this is the biggest case I've ever come across in terms of relevance and impact. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.